Karen is a professor of social and cultural history at Leeds Trinity University. Her research focus is on the rural, that is, conceptualizations of rural communities, landscapes and environments, human and animal relations in agricultural work on the farm, labour in field, farm and home, the interior spaces of farmhouse and cottage, as represented, worked and lived. Karen has published numerous books, chapters and articles. Of particular note in regards to today's discussions, and a text that I'm currently working through and would highly recommend, is the recently published book Managing the Experience of Hearing Loss in Britain, 1830 to 1930, which came out with Palgrave in the last few months, at the end of last year.
With my esteemed collaborator.
Well, as I was going to add, Karen co-authored this title with Graham Gooday, who we're also very glad to have with us today. And also of note for this afternoon, Karen has a forthcoming monograph for Routledge entitled Farm Animals in Britain 1850 to 2001. And the title of Karen's talk for us today is The Cure of Diseased or Injured Animals, Humanity, Use Value and Animal Economy.
So today I want to raise, I guess, some issues of, some questions where human and non-human animal come together. Some questions potentially around intersection. I was aware from Ryan that this would be quite an interdisciplinary event. So I thought, right, I'm just going to go for questions rather than a smoothly told sort of narrative. One of the things that I've been very struck by, though, is the similarity already between my own work, when I concentrate, as you'll have gathered, in the Victorian period and the 20th century, with Sunny's work on the medieval period, and that there are definitely sort of follow-through kind of points. And history can often have these quite artificial cut-off points in terms of periodisation, which I think are not always helpful. That continuity is largely as helpful as thinking about change, and history is really a lot messier than our human tendency to tell nice linear straightforward stories is kind of drawn towards. So I was aware that many of you would not be necessarily aware of the animals that I work with, in that even animal studies and animal history doesn't yet do very much with livestock. And it's livestock that I principally focus on. And so I looked for a quote which would capture the way in which livestock were sort of represented, conceptualised in the 19th century, and I was immediately struck with the similarities to Sunny's work in the way that they were being treated here. So this is from the Morning Chronicle, which was a relatively sort of radical left-leaning paper for the period, and said paper was choosing to have a little bit of a go at the farmers, who apparently were complaining that they were not that well off. The Royal Agricultural Society, they had these annual events. The Royal Agricultural Society of England was formed in the 1830s. It was very focused on science, and practice through science was kind of their strapline. So they had these annual shows that the cities nationally competed to hold. There's this show at Lewes. The stock are received into the yard today, and judging from the specimens that have been passing through the town and into the show yard, it is quite apparent that any distress which the farmers may have experienced during the recent free trade years, sorry about the typo, that's not tears, so some subconscious effect there, has not been allowed to affect their cattle. Fat, sleek and symmetrical, wanting only in that enormous obesity which it has been the object of the society for several years past to discourage. The animals show every quality that would delight the eye of their breeder, and when viewing their fine, well-proportioned forms, I think this is probably sounding very familiar to you by now, Sonny, one is at a loss to realise that distress among the agriculturalists, which is so generally vouched for in this district, that one is for a moment tempted to believe it real. The beautifully sarcastic tone of phrase there by the Morning Chronicle. But you can see how the physical presence of the animals' bodies is taken to be indicative of the success, I suppose, of the farmers in the area, their ability to provide high quality food to those animals, which are then converted into fine looking animal bodies. At the time, breeders bred as much for an aesthetic as for productive value, and in fact they saw the aesthetics as indicative of the expected possibilities of productive value from those animals. So they would see animals of certain shape and proportion as probably being able to produce more milk if they're cattle, or more beef, or better wool if they're sheep, and so on and so forth. So they bred for an aesthetic, and this was celebrated in animal portraiture at the time when animals won prizes at these shows. The proud owners made these beautiful portraits which they hung in their great homes and so on. And this is something that Harriet Rootvo has spoken about, particularly with reference to the Chillingham cattle, which were a sort of a rare, very much a constructed rare breed, which was entirely tied into ideas of national identity and a sort of original Britishness as well. So there's a language that intersects a lot with racial discourse as you go through the 19th century. It also intersects increasingly with ideas of national efficiency, what gets called in America national hygiene, and eugenics and so on as well. It sort of represents all of these things. So the agricultural shows defined norms and set standards by putting animals and also machinery on display and awarding prizes to them. And the animals were almost sort of parts of the machinery of agriculture of the period in terms of the perspective of the humans that owned them and bred them. So specific categories were created for livestock based on their age, sex, breed and use, and there were hierarchies of that. The horses were at the top. The stallions were at the top of the hierarchy, so it's a gendered hierarchy. Pigs were at the bottom. Sometimes the animals were named. The higher within the hierarchy the animal was, the fancier the name. So a prize bull would be called something like the Duke of Bedfordshire. Whereas something like pigs were often not named, but I did come across a lovely name for a pig, which was Miss Bucket. So there's more work to be done there to do with the naming of animals in terms of livestock, I think, when I get time. So yeah, hierarchies based on age, sex, breed and use. During the period of the 19th century, increasingly breeders formed specialist societies and herd books which sort of accounted for and traced the heritage and origins of their particular herds and animals. And sort of increased their value. It's like by curating them, they increased the value. That was not just then a productive value in terms of their use on the farm, but also a cultural value. So agriculture starts to become increasingly important. And as I said, they're the bodies of the well-proportioned, sleek and symmetrical, show-worthy livestock driven through human space get placed in the pens for display. These are taken to be visible indicators of the well-being of the farming class that owns them, which is a sort of an elite class for the period. So the non-human animal body is treated as a metric for human prosperity, which all sounds very familiar. We're getting deja vu, which we often do in history, don't we? So this is very much about the perfected bodies of the stock. Now, when looking for disability, I know Ryan found various cattle with wooden legs or other forms of prosthesis. I've never yet found such a beast, and we were just talking about the need perhaps to try and, what geographers would call ground truth that, to see are there any actual cases, or where there are cases, how many cases there are, to what extent the perception of the possibility of this impacts locally. Does somebody think this is a good idea because they've seen that in the periodical press and so on? There's interesting sort of digging to do into that. But the kinds of agricultural texts that I use are the publications from the Royal Agricultural Society of England, so the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society of England, and then gradually the more sort of formal veterinary texts. I'm not a veterinary historian, unlike my collaborator Abigail Woods, who's properly a veterinary historian. But in between those, you get texts like this one by John Shearer, who is really the inheritor, again, of the kind of thing that Sunny's talking about. There's almost like a recycling of much older literature and then added to that, almost almanac style, other material. In his case, he talks about farm management. There are discussions not just about veterinary treatments and common diseases connected with horses, but also he talks about shooting, angling. It's kind of a hunting, shooting, fishing book, and it's probably more suitable to the club library than the farm office, if you see what's in it, as a kind of text. But it's setting standards, it's defining norms in exactly the way that Sonny was just talking about. So it sets off with a lovely sort of introductory narrative about the history of veterinary medicine and medical approaches to animals, which is interestingly dismissive of what's been going on in Britain, and kind of fits with that chronology that you spoke about, which sort of says, oh, it's an 18th century phenomenon as veterinary medicine. So he sort of generalises about the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, and says the works of ancient veterinary writers became objects of search and desire. The art became a study. The body of the horse was described anatomically. Schools began to be established for professional instruction. The medicinal part of veterinarianism was more generally cultivated and, at least in some instances, under accredited medical professors. So it's like a discourse is forming. Every branch of equine economy, whether as regards the harness or the trappings, equitation, the military menage, or the riding of the horse, the methodical treatment of the hoof, accompanied with the invention of various forms of iron shoes, as well as their scientific adaptation to the foot, were eagerly pursued, and mostly with success. And he says that this is something that happens outside of Britain and then eventually comes to England. Not straight to England, comes from the edges of Britain, as it were, first. The new veterinary art, having rapidly diffused itself over a large portion of the European continent, soon reached England, where the cure of diseased or injured animals had, from time immemorial, been given over to the tender mercies of leeches and farriers, whose ignorance generally was only rivalled by their inhumanity. Now this is where you get an interesting sort of twist to the tale as you get into the 19th century. The treatment of animals becomes seen as indicative of the level of humanity of the humans. So it's indicative of modernity. All of these are very loaded sort of categories of the period. So modernity, of civilization, and the rewriting, in a sense, of texts that deal with animals pushes away what is seen as older, inhumane treatments and methods of thinking and dealing with animals. So that's partly reflected in the medical assessment and treatment of animals. It's also thought of in terms of the welfare of animals. So animals in cities get looked at and scrutinised very closely. Cattle being driven to market are seen to be problematic when they escape and hurt the people in the area. But then the treatment of the cattle themselves, if they're beaten or in any other way maltreated, this becomes an issue. And so you have the formation of what are seen as more rational, sort of intellectual approaches to animals. And farm animals, gradually through the 19th century, are sort of removed from the city by various statutes and laws, not just to do with are you allowed to keep pigs in the city, but how are you supposed to treat animals, what is the health of cattle in city dairies, and so on and so forth. So farm animals get taken out of the city and made to be much more spatially farm animals in a very literal way. It's a gradual process, depends on the species, but it's all to do with this idea of civilization and modernity. So your period, I'm afraid, is cast aside as uncivilized and profoundly unmodern. So, when I was looking for disability within productive non-human animals, I ended up looking at human space and human texts, and ended up with something that seemed to be about cure, and then cure seeming to be about production within capitalist 19th century sort of modes of production, and something I haven't been able to disentangle this, but it's something to do with labour process, use value, and being able to retrieve this. So if an animal misbehaves, it should be corrected in such a way as to make it continue to be useful. If an elite animal is injured, it should be cured, if at all possible, to at least get some use out of it, even if it's stepped down. And we have an example here of something to do with the damage of ligaments near the joints, to do with inflammation, sprains, fractures, and so on. Obviously, multiple etiologies. The horse is termed rigged in the back because he is most generally affected about the loins. The difficulty he shows in turning, giving to his body a kind of jerk, according as he may be turned either to the left or the right, has given to the term rig. So very much a visual sort of diagnosis going on here to do with normative bodily behaviour and movement through space. And if he be trotted, he will have such a rolling gait accompanied with such apparent weakness that what is the matter with him is at once perceived. There are, however, many horses called chinked in the back, which may, in a measure, be restored for slow work, by giving them as much rest as possible, as this kind of ankylosis of the backbone does not interfere with the animal employed in slow farm labour. So that hierarchy again is apparent. If the disease takes place in either of the fetlock joints, pastons, knee, hock or stifle, the horse will be totally useless, and a cure is impossible. So in other words, cure here, to my eye, reads as if you can cure an animal in such a way as to restore it for work in human service. You can employ it in human service in some fashion. Now, partly I was trying to tangle with the sources here in ways which would reveal disability, and none of the language that we would use in connection with disability was applicable to the 19th century text. So I was trying to sort of run through a mental thesaurus of thinking of what would be appropriate. And that's an exercise that Graham and I also had to do when we were dealing with deafness and hearing loss. It becomes quite a complex tale in its own right. But this chinked in the back is part of the language of disability of the period. And then I went to the human texts, and there were some very large-scale investigative commissions in the 19th century that studied, in these cases, particularly women's work in agriculture. So again, you're looking for people who ought to be useful, apparently. And I found these. Mr. Overman employs two, i.e. women, constantly. One married, the other about 22 years of age, single. The latter has worked on the farm for 9 years. She is so near-sighted that she could not go into service. So domestic service was the sort of within the hierarchy of employment and respectability in the 19th century, was the better employment, the more respectable employment for a single woman. So ideally, they ought to go into domestic service. If they come from a well-regulated household, using the terms of the time, they're properly behaved and they're moral and they've got a little bit of money to buy themselves some uniform and so on. They get a bit of education. About the age of 12, they go off into domestic service. But this woman cannot, because she's too nearsighted. So a later report within the same inquiry, those who continue to work as young women in the fields are very few, and there is generally something against them. Either they are deformed, or deaf and dumb, or they are girls whom service is not suited. Some have had what is usually termed a misfortune, in other words, they've fallen pregnant, out of wedlock. So, if you've crossed the bounds morally, or you're unable to harness yourself to work properly in a normative way, or you are deformed or deaf and dumb. So in other words, you're not fitting into any of the normative categories of the period for a respectable working class girl, then you're disabled. Seems to be what's going on here. So there are things here to do with behaviour as well as to do with physical bodily presence. There's a sort of moral disability, and it seems very equivalent to the horse's behavioural difficulties that get cured. Except when it's girls, you can't cure them, especially if they've had a misfortune. That's it, you're done for. Just retest the dead of us. So, if you're looking at the villages, rural villages, obviously they're in the Victorian period. You have institutions that come into play that are new. You have workhouses and so on, which are involved in supporting those who are unable to work, and they deal with the able-bodied and those who are not able-bodied in the terms of the time. So the guardians, this are the people who manage the workhouses. The guardians have been steadily refusing to grant outdoor relief to idiots and imbeciles, not in asylums, because those are the other institutions for normalcy. And the result has been that since 1871 there has been no village idiot in the Action Union, whereas in old times there was no village or hamlet which had not its idiot or imbecile to be the laughing stock of the children and often of the seniors. This is especially insisted upon by Mr. Bowen-Jones in his report, so providing some evidence for that. So those deemed to have absolutely no capacity for work whatsoever in the Victorian period are taken out of the picture altogether and placed in workhouses and asylums, and that is seen to be an improvement because the way they're casting this, they're representing this as somehow a compassionate response. This is not our response to it, I make that completely clear, but it's what they think is somehow a compassionate response. And you can see the disability here is actually formed in the response of the people in the village as much as anything else in terms of their work. So what I can't work out is, in terms of the animal, non-human animals, if there is something equivalent to the categories that we used here with reference to the humans of idiots and imbeciles, and that was a question that came up in the first session to do with other forms of disability other than physical. And I think it's just because I haven't yet found the language and the key words to search for. Because once I find these things, I find the material, I find it in the sources. It's just, it takes a lot of effort as a historian to get the right language, to find the right words. But the material then is there, it becomes apparent. So this is partly about the process of research. The other thing I wanted to point out and to think about was a reference to do with energy. So in terms of the physical capacity to labour, the Victorians had quite a nice set of comparative values. This is from 1909, but these are quite typical sort of understandings of the values of the energy, the power that any particular body had to do work. And in reports on mill work, you will find there's an estimation of children who are rated as being sort of 0.85% horsepower. So this is very pervasive. You know, it's all pervasive. Animals and human, non-animals and all species were referred to in terms of energy expressed as horsepower. Notice, by the way, that one horse actually is not 1 horsepower. So just bear that in mind. It goes back to some original work that they did on steam power. So animal power, the power of animals working 8 hours per day in comparison with the standard horsepower of 33,000 foot-pounds per minute is as follows. Horse, 22,000 foot-pounds per minute. Ox, 11 to 12,000 foot-pounds per minute. Mule, 10,000 foot-pounds per minute. Ass, 3,000 foot-pounds per minute. Man, turning a crank or pumping water, 2,000 to 2,750 foot-pounds per minute. So when they were curing a non-human animal sufficient to work, the Victorians were seeking to recoup an investment in the potential energy of that animal, non-human animal, as well as the economic value and the cultural value in terms of breeding and production. When employing on the field, so it's women who are deemed unemployable in domestic service. Their productive capacity was to an extent retrieved, but so was their energy, and principally it's their energy that's retrieved. So the intersection, to my mind, of human and non-human, animal, physical and sensory disability seems to be in this issue to do with energy. There's something going on here to do with energy that I want to try and work out. And something to do with consumption, I suppose, of labour power, which led me to be rereading Capital last night, but I didn't get much further forward with it. So that's it. That's all I've got to say, with no further conclusion.